Hello and welcome to Asian Insider. I'm your host, Bhagyashree Garekar, and we're recording this episode on Tuesday, the 17th of March, 2026. It's the 18th day of the Iran war, and to sum up the joint US military operation quickly, some of the top Iranian leaders have been killed, the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei on the very first day, and then today, two other senior leaders, Iran's powerful security chief, Ali Larijani, and also Ghulam Raza Soleimani, the head of Basij, which was Iran's internal security force that crushed mass protests in Iran in January. And here in the US, President Donald Trump says he does not need help from NATO allies or Japan or South Korea or Australia to help restore normalcy in the Hormuz Strait, which is in a complete state of blockade. Now, to help us make sense of where this war is headed is our guest today, UCLA Professor Benjamin Radd. He's a scholar of US foreign policy and an authority on the politics in the Middle East, especially Iran. Welcome, Professor Radd.
Thank you for having me on.
You monitor Iran very closely. Could you give us a sense of what's happening in Iran? Is the regime, for instance, strong and capable of waging a long war?
Well, by almost all accounts, the regime is now weaker than it was at the start of the year. It has lost its top-tier leadership. I would say it's even lost its second-tier leadership. It is lacking the ability to defend its own sovereign territory, lost complete control of its air superiority to what extent it had any. It is seeing its ballistic missile stockpile depleting, as it is both being used against the United States and Israel and also Gulf neighbors, but at the same time seeing its its stockpiles and its launchers being destroyed. And then its drone inventory, which it has used to great effect to cause asymmetric damage, has also been depleted. It's now resorted really to the one leverage point that it has, which is choking off all commerce and cargo traffic through the Persian Gulf via the Strait of Hormuz. And that is where we've seen the last few days efforts concentrated both by the United States and by the international community. As a consequence of this has been a spike in the price of oil globally.
Do you see signs that Iranians are rallying around the new leaders? We know that Nowruz, the Parsi traditional New Year, is at hand. It's on Friday, I believe. And we've heard reports of the regime there asking for rallies, pro-Islamic Republic rallies. Would you have a sense of what's going on that front?
There is no indication that there is a mass rally around the flag effect. There was talk of this happening last summer after the initial strikes in June by the United States and Israel. No such rally and mobilization happened. And there's even less likely this will happen now in light of the killing of civilian protesters back in January. So I think to the effect that we see any supporters of the regime out in the streets, either today, as we saw some during the pre-holiday of Charshamba Suri, going all the way to Nowruz, as you indicated, on Friday, on March 21st, they most likely will be those who are existing regime supporters, those who are brought out into the streets at the behest of the government and their family members, public employees, public servants, things of that nature. But there is very little indication the regime has any support broadly beyond the 20% or so that is already in its corner.
Do you have a sense of what the support like, or what is President Trump regarded as, and what is the impression of the United States after this war began?
We have an interesting scenario where a country that is being bombed has the majority of its population supporting the bombing, and then the country that is doing the bombing, in this case the United States, has a majority that is opposed to the bombing. So that dichotomy, I think it also reflects really where we suspect Iranian public sentiment is, though it's hard to gauge because there's been a communications blackout and messages are difficult to receive. But Iranians, the majority of the population, are fed up with the Islamic Republic, fed up with clerical rule, with theocratic autocracy, and have supported attempts at removing this regime by whatever means necessary. Now, I say that because we have seen many social media posts, residents, especially from my hometown of Shiraz, where they're watching these F-16 jets flying over the city and they're cheering on, not knowing where the bombs will land, saying on video they don't care where it lands. They just want it to cause devastation against the regime's security forces, its oppressive police state, in the hopes that eventually it will dismantle that. So, we see incidents like this. We see video, we see messages coming out, phone calls, indications that there is still a general support. However, there is also the weariness and the anxiety that comes with living in a war environment where there are bombs and missiles being dropped that shatter windows, that displace people from their homes, that destroy vehicles and private property. I mean, this is a country that did not prepare its people for war. So unlike other countries where you'd have early warning systems and bomb shelters and bunkers and things of that nature, Iranians don't enjoy any of these things. This is not a government that invested in the domestic security of its people. And we're seeing the cost of that now, coupled with the fact that Israel now seems to be targeting, on a pinpoint basis, Basij forces, manning checkpoints in the streets, temporary tents that they've set up because they're afraid to go to their headquarters, depots where they're keeping their weapons. A unfortunate consequence of these targets are that inevitably there'll be civilians in the vicinity. And even if they're doing precise drone strikes, it's almost impossible to guarantee that there'll be no civilian casualties. So there is that anxiety, absolutely. But I think that by and large, the majority is still in favor of any operation that will result in the removal of this government.
I see. And do you think that the Iranian regime, which we know is made up of very hardline people, and I think much harder than the current Ayatollah, for instance, is regarded as a much more hardline person, even if he's a figurehead, and the powers behind the throne are the IRGC. Do you think that as the regime, like you say, is weak and is coming under sustained attack from the US and Israel, do you think they might attempt to make a nuclear bomb or a dirty bomb where conventional bomb materials are mixed with some kind of nuclear material? From the reports that are out there, we do know that they do have a large stock of enriched uranium. And I think the estimates are that 10 to 16 bombs can be made in a relatively short time. Do you think there is the ability to do that? And also, could there be an intent to do that? Could we see a scenario of a more desperate regime wanting to do something dangerous like this for its own survival?
I think since June of last year, when we saw the initial round of Israeli and American strikes, this is a regime that has been fighting for its existential survival. The writing was on the wall, the clock was ticking, that its time was limited. And again, when we saw the uprisings in January, and I think part of the reason the crackdown was as brutal and as bloody as it was because the regime saw it as an existential problem. There was a scenario where there were, tens of hundreds of thousands of Iranians protesting in streets throughout the country, big cities, small cities. And this was an organic, homegrown opposition to the government's policy. So I think that indicated to them that they have problems, and that so whatever they can do to ensure survival, they will do. They've demonstrated this. And I'm not a believer that there are these stratified layers of hardliners and moderates. At the end of the day, everybody that has been in government, in the Iranian government, beginning at the start of the new year, before they were killed in the initial wave of strikes, everyone who is there now, they were all either participants or at best bystanders to the horrific, brutal crackdown that we saw in January. They are all complicit in the actions of the regime. So this idea that Mojtaba Khamenei is more hardline than his father, or this IRGC leader is more pragmatic than that one, at the end of the day, we're talking about difference in degree, but not a difference in kind. And so I think that those distinctions don't ultimately matter. Now, to get to the question of Iran's nuclear capacity, there's about a little over 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium that Iran has. 200 kilograms is buried still somewhere under Esfahan that is not reachable. The combined 400 plus allows it to build anywhere between 10 to 11 bombs. However, it's one thing to basically build a bomb in a matter of weeks. It's another thing to then reconfigure that bomb so that it can fit on top of a warhead that can be then delivered elsewhere. That is the issue here. So in other words, yes, it can build a bomb. It can't necessarily launch it. It can't deploy it. The process of shrinking a nuclear bomb into a warhead that can fit on the tip of a ballistic missile, could take months, years. And so that is, I think, something to keep in mind. What is of concern is the evidence that Iran has tried to reconstitute its nuclear enrichment program after the events of last summer and against IAEA restrictions and beyond what it is allowed to do under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So that remains a concern. But I'm not concerned that Iran can, let's say, rush to nuclearize and nuclearize in a way that can be delivered. That remains something that is beyond its technical abilities, at least for this calendar year, and if not, probably a year beyond that.
We know that North Korea is an ally of Iran. Would you rule out the possibility that some bomb-making tech could come from there?
So,
illicit, clandestine, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what would be needed would be essentially an almost semi-finished bomb itself, because at this point the Iranians have they have the know-how, they have the scientific proficiency to assemble a bomb. It's then making sure that it can fit into a ballistic missile, and maybe they can get North Korean scientists that can help accelerate and expedite that process. It's still something that has to be done in Iran. You can't export a nuclear warhead really across. I mean, you can't put it on a cargo ship and send it through the Strait. You can't put it on a train or in a cargo plane and fly it over international airspace. I mean, that's just the North Koreans simply would not be able to get away with that, nor I think would they risk such a thing. So that puts us in a position where this is something Iran has to do and has to do on its own, and whether it's with the assistance of North Koreans or maybe hypothetically rogue Pakistani elements who were, essentially responsible for the North Korean weapon to begin with. All of this is conceivable, absolutely, but it still underscores the issue for Iran is not enriching the uranium, and it's not manufacturing the bomb, but it's actually getting it to a small enough size that it can be deliverable, and that remains the obstacle.
Well, there's also Russia. I mean, across the Caspian Sea, right? Mm-hmm. Would you rule that out? I mean, Russia is helping them with military intelligence, for instance.
I think Russia will gladly assist Iran in any low-level way it can that will keep the United States bogged down in the conflict, that will deplete U.S. resources, that will deplete the ability of the United States to provide assistance to Ukraine. And what we're seeing effectively is a tit-for-tat response to what the United States is providing the Ukrainians with regards to assistance, weapons, logistical support, that helps Ukrainians target Russian fighters and Russian assets, both in Ukraine and in Russia itself. So I think what we're seeing is sort of one side matching the other in terms of what they're doing. For Russia to go beyond that, beyond, let's say, providing satellite coordinates for US troops or US installations, to actually providing material items equivalent to a nuclear warhead, I think would be a threshold that Putin does not want to cross, because he would be then really invoking all of NATO to respond. And he simply doesn't have the second strike capability to withstand a multi-front attack that would involve NATO.
So what is the extent to which this desperate regime weakening and afraid of running for its own survival, to what extent could it go?
So there's really two, maybe three scenarios that could happen. Number one, that there is an internal coup resulting in a consolidation of power, not in the office of the supreme leader, but in something resembling a sort of military junta. Senior IRGC officers, maybe several of them, 3, 4, who cumulatively have enough control, influence, and credibility amongst the levers of power, amongst the military in Iran, to basically try to stabilize the situation. They could either then decide to maintain this sort of front of a supreme leader under the constitution, or they can just discard that entirely in some sort of an emergency government, which they could then run indefinitely. So some sort of a military dictatorship style scenario. That's one option. The other option would be to basically stay the course. Mojtaba, whether he's alive or not, whether he's incapacitated or not, it's irrelevant. The office of the supreme leader remains. They use that as a sort of symbolic figurehead. And then you still have a consortium of senior level officials running the country behind the scenes. Alternatively, you could have the Israelis now showing that their ability and willingness to go after every leader, no matter where they are on the power hierarchy. So we saw that with Larijani, we saw that with Soleimani. The idea basically is to intimidate all Iranian leadership and say, look, it doesn't matter who you replace, you're going to be hunted and taken down. And to then maybe instigate or foment defection, desertion from the various units, or just an abandoning of the campaign, and a willingness to come to some sort of a ceasefire arrangement that will leave the Americans and the Israelis satisfied. And then the last option would be an internal revolution, one that now sees the regime's forces weakened enough and weapons provided to the protesters or possible revolutionaries, or overcoming a sense of fear that if they go out into the streets and begin to really take over regime installations, that they'll be slaughtered. If that status is achieved, then that is the other outcome that can happen. What I don't see happening is a long-term attrition stalemate, because I don't think that the Iranian government has the bandwidth, the capacity, the resources to really sustain a campaign like this for much longer than a few more weeks.
So within the various options that you just laid out, is there scope for, or do you see any particular moderate leader who could emerge as as a more long-term to provide long-term sustained leadership?
Yeah, and I think really the viable candidate for that, some have pointed to the Speaker of Parliament, Ghalibaf. I think actually it would be former President Hassan Rouhani, who, again, had the office of the presidency, is considered part of a sort of pragmatist, not really reform, but as close as you can get to reform within this cadre of leadership, and one who has been out of the fray, out of the circle for now, one who has not sort of had his hands stained, if you will, by the events of the last few weeks and the last few months, and I think has enough of is enough of a known entity that would give him the legitimacy and the credibility to help take Iran into the next phase, whatever that phase ends up being, whether he serves as a transitional figure, whether he emerges as a new type of figure in a newly revamped system, maintaining a lot of the elements of the old regime. Any of those are possibilities. So I think if you go beyond Ghalibaf, because now that Larijani is taken out as an option, I think Hassan Rouhani is a viable candidate.
Is there much news of him? I seem not to be hearing about him at all.
We don't hear from him, and we don't, and by any accounts, we're not seeing that Israel or the United States is in fact targeting him. And I think he is sidelined maybe for a reason. He's savvy enough to know that he's waiting, biding his time. Maybe he doesn't have he's not in the good favor of the remaining power elite now that Khamenei is gone. I mean, granted, he was getting pushed aside anyway. But there's maybe talk of him possibly being a successor supreme leader if Khamenei the elder Khamenei were alive, but that time has now passed. And I think that he doesn't really have the following and the support of those vying for power right now. And so that puts him sort of at odds with current leadership, but that doesn't mean that he's to be discounted.
Now turning to Iran's Arab neighbors. Now they've taken hits onto their civilian infrastructure as well, right? The airports, the hotels, the residential areas, oil facilities, even desalination plants. Now you also have casualties. I'm not sure what the exact figure is. It probably hasn't been totaled up, but it's definitely in the high dozens, right? My question is, in light of everything that they've seen so far, is their faith in the US, their biggest security guarantor, is it shaken? And do they want this war to continue?
If there's anything that's been shaken, I think it's their faith and belief in Iran's role as let's say, as a productive neighbor in the region, one that is there to promote stability and the success of all countries, rather than being a force of destabilization. Now, are these Gulf states displeased with the Israeli and the American decision unilaterally to launch this attack? Absolutely. There's no question this is not a war they asked for. But also what this has done is it has revealed to them, not that they needed to know this directly, they understood this, but it has now really made clear how much of a destabilizing agent Iran can be, not because Iran is acting in its self-defense and responding to Israel and the United States, but what we're seeing now in the Strait of Hormuz, Iran and its willingness to go after U.S. bases, installations, servicemen and women who are housed in these Gulf states, but is doing so in a very indiscriminate manner, targeting civilian areas like airports, high-rises, hotels, residential buildings, things like that. It's really demonstrating that in Iran's attempt to maintain its own survival, it is willing now to undermine the safety and security of its Gulf neighbors. And these are neighbors who have relied very much on this illusion of safety and as a place where both tourists and investors can come, and that it is free from conflict, that that they have very stable governments, and that basically it is a safe haven financially, recreationally, you name it. It has shattered that illusion, and that the Gulf states hold Iran responsible. Not to mention the disruption in the oil markets and in trade and commerce, which is added insult to all of this. So I think if anything is shaken, it's their belief that this regime can be a contributing factor and a positive player in the region.
Well, maybe like you say, they resent the unilateral war, but they retain faith in the U.S. Would you put it a little more positively?
I would put it that way. I'd say they've demonstrated that they believe in the U.S.'s ability and the ability of the military resources that the U.S. has provided them to keep the overall safety of their population. Of course, we're seeing some drones penetrate. We're seeing definitely some attacks that hit targets, and some casualties may result. But also, when we see footage, social media footage of Arab residents in these countries, they're showing that they and news media that's going out to talk to people on the street, they feel confident, they feel secure that they are going to be kept safe by their leader. So I think what you're seeing for now, though, that could change if Iran decides to really unleash a more intensive barrage salvo of weapons against these countries. It hasn't done so yet. It's reserved that really, I think, for Israel and U.S. forces and U.S. installations. But if Iran decides to really unleash after civilian Gulf targets, then I think that dynamic can change. But for now, it is not going in Iran's favor with regards to public sentiment.
But so far, the Arabs have basically been in a defense mode. They have not attacked Iran directly. Could that change?
I think it will have to change at some point when their national security interests are threatened even more so, when their economic and financial interests are threatened. They can only really sustain this sort of passive role for so long. It's not that the United States needs the assistance of Arab armies to conduct strikes. There's nothing militarily that needs to be done that the U.S. and Israel cannot do. I think what we're seeing, what we need to see, and what the president has requested is support from allies with regards to facilitating the passage of oil tankers and other cargo ships through the Gulf, through the Strait. And that, I think, is where these Arab states can be supportive. Lastly, I should add one more thing. The UAE, and to a lesser extent Qatar, really operate as a financial hub, as the bank for Iran's IRGC operations and other regime corporations and entities that are essentially funding Iran's operations both domestically and abroad. There's no reason that these states cannot really pressure these semi-private banks to close those accounts and to basically make it impossible for Iran to engage anyway with the international market, given that its access to the SWIFT banking system has already been shut off based on U.S. sanctions. So that is, I think, another area that they could be a decisive blow in response that doesn't involve any military action.
Right. Now, I did also want to ask you about the mood in the U.S. So we talked, Professor Radd, after the very first day of the strikes, and then which of course killed the Ayatollah, and you described that outcome as a plus for President Trump, because it was the end of the I guess repressive dictator who led these chants of death to America for decades and decades. Now, at this moment, and you talked about it, opinion polls are seem to show that most Americans don't approve of this war, and today, in fact, the national counter-terrorism chief resigned on that basis. So, where is President Trump now? Is he in a big mess, and what might be a good way out for him?
Yeah, he's definitely in a precarious position domestically. I mean, there is not overwhelming broad majority support for the war. There is not the support he wants to see even within the Republican Party. And I don't take this resignation from Joe Kent to be that critical. I mean, he's part of the office of the DNI, which has been all but marginalized in Trump's second term. We've heard nothing from Tulsi Gabbard, even going back to last year in the operation against Maduro in Venezuela. We've not seen her at any press briefings, any events, none whatsoever. I mean, I wonder what she's even doing. And so we keep in mind that Joe Kent was effectively her deputy or operating out of that office. So it's just possible that there are different views on what this conflict represents and what it is. But that aside, there's no question that Joe Kent and his views speak for a sizable segment of not just the American electorate, but specifically the Republican electorate, those that are traditionally in Trump's MAGA base. If the war continues, the concern isn't so much that it gets dragged on. The issue is that the president's messaging, what exactly is the objective? What would the United States consider as victory? What does the United States need to see happen? None of these have been articulately laid out and presented to the American people. He has not attempted to really sell this war to Congress. He refuses to even call it a war, calls it an excursion. So I think it's sort of what it's doing is it's dismissing the concerns that many in his party and outside the party have about the legitimacy, the scope, the constitutionality of this conflict, of this war, why it was necessary, and what the end goals are and whether or not they can be achieved. And I think, the bigger question of, let's assume the United States accomplishes what it wants. What does the day after look like? What comes next for Iran? Is there a plan? None of that has been presented either. And so what we're seeing then is this sort of rogue operation where the executive branch on its own, without consulting allies beyond Israel, without consulting other branches of government, really sort of decided to opt for this and failed really also to make that message clear and the purpose clear to the American people. That is going to be an issue this year in particular because it is a midterm election year. And I can see that if we go a few more weeks and these elements are not clearly explained, they're not addressed, then I could see it becoming a campaign problem more and more as we get closer to November.
So you mentioned a few more weeks, right? And constitutionally, we do know that he's required to go and seek authorization. President Trump is required to go and seek authorization from Congress 60 days from the start of the war. So that's April, right? I mean, he's like, I think, like you say, a few more weeks. So do you take that to be like, can we infer from that the war might end around then?
I think I don't think Iran has the capacity or the bandwidth to sustain this for more than 2 or 3 more weeks. Now, the United States did at the beginning of the conflict, I think, set out a 4 to 5 week timeline to meet its objectives. Maybe that timeline is still realistic. I think it probably fits with where everything else is aligning. But I just can't see an Iranian government that has its leadership taken out one by one, that has its resources depleted, that is also going to suffer as a result of the closing of the Strait of Hormuz. It's difficult to see how this leadership can sustain and how it can, and how we don't see fragmentation and infighting and a split in the government itself. So yes, there is tremendous pressure on President Trump. There is tremendous pressure on the American side, the Israeli side, to see this through and to spell out objectives. But I think we don't want to overlook what is happening within Iran. And what makes that difficult is because there's no visibility, there's no media, there's no coverage of this. We simply see sort of Iran as this 10-foot tall monster capable of, resurrecting itself anytime someone is one of its limbs is sort of removed. But I think that really misses the reality of what could be happening underneath. And I think that this is a country right now really without sound leadership, without experience diplomatically, now that Larijani is dead, to bring about a closure that would leave it satisfied. So I think that what we're now doing is a race for time. Which country will deplete its resources first? Will it be the United States and Israel militarily? Will it be Iran politically, diplomatically? And so I think in that sense, it is a conflict of attrition, but not along similar axes.
Right. And we do, of course, have the Marines as well. And I believe they should reach within a week or so.
Yes. Yeah. And I believe a battalion is what they've indicated. About 1,000 would be needed if they decided to do any kind of a ground invasion that would go after the 200 kilograms of highly enriched uranium in the Esfahan facility.
Right. Or alternatively, they could be deployed to help, with unfreezing the Strait of Hormuz.
They can, though I think in order to do that, they really still, both the United States and Israel have to be more thorough about taking out Iran's defense capabilities. We're talking about drones and cruise missiles, surface-to-surface missiles, really, that because in the Kharg Island especially is within reach of the mainland. And I think using that as a starting point or a launching point for a U.S. takeover of the Gulf, if you will, is a huge endeavor. I think the United States is capable of it. But I think it would, in order to really convince carriers and insurance companies that they are no risk or very minimal risk, it needs more resources. And I think that is where the international community, as President Trump has indicated, would be of support to that.
Right. And because we talked about the forces being deployed to take out the enriched uranium, Those would be the special forces, not the Marines as such, right? And it's the Marines that we hear of as being
Yes, the Marines would be essentially a support group. They would be there to provide the support needed, the cover needed, military cover, and other ways of assisting special forces, whether it's from the U.S. military, whether it's CIA paramilitary special forces, whatever it consists of. The Marines would be there to provide the sort of logistical and other kinetic backup so that these forces can go into Isfahan, which is quite a distance away from the Gulf, and get in and get out.
Right. That sounds very difficult. And I'm guessing just looking at the maps. So, and I'm sure it's all hilly, mountainous terrain. So, it sounds very challenging indeed.
Indeed, absolutely.
Right. And possibly the way that these operations are carried out, you hear of them maybe only after they're through.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. For all we know, they could be underway now.
Perhaps. Well, I guess the last question would be, you've said it's going to end, it's a matter of a few weeks, but how do you see this war ending? Would it be a clear victory? And, who's going to win?
If we start seeing visible defections from the besieged, from the IRGC, if we start seeing, for example, the Israelis or the Americans knocking out the communication system that the state uses to broadcast, or if we see, better yet, a takeover of the state's system, you start seeing a continued Israeli pressure on besieged forces, on the oppressive sort of police state elements and the attributes, right? I think when the fear starts to diminish from the civilian population and they feel confident to take what they believe is rightfully theirs, that to me is, I think, where this will end. I think that what's going to happen is a combination of the Israeli strikes against regime targets, these pinpoint strikes, coupled with U.S. using these massive ordinances to take out larger installations, and then Iran depleting its own resources of ballistic missiles, Iran further antagonizing Arab states. All of this will be a cost that's too much for the regime to bear. And so what will happen is you'll just start seeing either infighting, a breakdown, or a complete defection, and maybe a coup from within, and a contingent rises that is willing to bring this to a peaceful end. That is, I think, where we'll end up.
All right. Well, on that note, we should wrap up. Thank you for all the very clear explanations and insights, Professor Radd.
My pleasure.
This is Asian Insider. I'm Bhagyashree Garekar. This episode was produced with the help of Faiza Sunny in Singapore. We hope you enjoyed the show and will share it with your family and friends. You can also sign up for our Asian Insider newsletter. Thank you for joining us and see you in the next episode.